Welcome back, dear friend. Tonight, you don't need to carry anything with you. Not the weight of the day, not the thoughts still circling in your mind, not the things left undone. You can set them down now, gently, right here, at the edge of sleep. Take a slow breath with me. Breathe in through your nose. Let your chest rise and hold it just for a moment. Then breathe out slowly through your mouth and feel your shoulders drop. Tonight we travel to a very old place, a land called Uz, somewhere in the ancient East, where the fields were wide and the sky seemed larger than the sky you know, where the stars at night were countless and the mornings came slowly, gently, like a gift received. And in that land lived a man named Job. He was, by every measure, a good man. The story says simply, Job was blameless and upright. He feared God and turned away from evil, and his life showed it. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He had thousands of sheep and camels and oxen and donkeys. He was the greatest of all the people of the East. But what made Job remarkable was not the livestock or the land. It was the way he held it all. Every morning he rose early to pray for his children, just in case, he thought, just in case they had done something wrong and needed grace. He held everything loosely. He was grateful for it all. This is a man who knew that everything he had was given and lived accordingly. He was known at the city gates, where elders gathered to judge and advise. When Job arrived, the young men stepped aside. The elders rose. The princes stopped speaking. They waited for his words, because his words were worth waiting for. He helped the poor. He defended the widow. He was eyes to the blind and feet to the lame. He put on righteousness like a garment. He was a father to the needy. And the night was his time of peace. The lamp of God shone over his head. It was a good life. A full life. A life held with grateful, open hands. Tonight, before everything changes, let's sit here with Job for a moment, in this place of plenty, of gratitude, of ordinary mornings and long, peaceful evenings. Because the story that is about to unfold is not a story about a bad man getting what he deserved. It is a story about a good man and what happened to him and what he found in the middle of it. Let yourself settle in. Feel the quiet of the ancient night around you. We will walk with Job now, step by step, and we will not walk ahead of the story. Rest easy. We are just beginning. Job had built something beautiful, not just the estate, the life, the rhythm of it, the way the mornings began with prayer and the evenings ended in contentment, the way the household moved with purpose and care. His sons and daughters loved each other. They held feasts, rotating among their houses, inviting one another to eat and drink together. And when the round of feasting was over, Job would rise early and offer a prayer for each of them. 7 children, 7 prayers, carefully given. It may be, he thought, that my children have sinned and have forsaken God in their hearts. And so he prayed every morning, just to be sure. This is what faithfulness looks like from the inside. Not grand gestures, just the daily rising, the daily turning of the face toward what is good and holy and real. And then the story tells us something extraordinary. The heavenly beings gathered before God, and among them came the adversary, the one who walked back and forth on the earth, who observed and questioned everything. God said, "Have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, blameless and upright, a man who fears God and turns from evil." And the adversary answered, "Does Job fear God for nothing? You have put a hedge around him. You have blessed the work of his hands. His possessions have increased in the land. But stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face." It is a terrible test to propose, and yet God accepted the terms. "Everything that he has is in your hand," God said. "Only do not stretch out your hand against him." Job did not know this conversation was happening. He was rising with the sun in the land of Uz, going about his morning, offering his prayers, setting the day in motion. He did not know that his life was about to become the answer to a question he had never been asked. That is one of the most difficult things about suffering. It does not announce itself. It does not ask permission. It does not wait until you are ready. Job was not ready. None of us ever are. But the story knows something Job does not yet know, that this test, however terrible, is taking place within the gaze of one who has not forgotten him, who called him blameless, who sees him fully. That does not make the suffering smaller, but it means he will not be lost in it. Breathe slowly. What is coming is hard, but we will walk through it together. The day began like any other, and then the first messenger came. The oxen were plowing, and the donkeys were feeding beside them, he said, his voice shaking. And raiders fell upon them and carried them off. They killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. He was still speaking when the second messenger arrived. The fire of God fell from heaven, said another, and burned up the sheep and the servants, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And before that one had finished, the third came running. The Chaldeans formed 3 raiding parties and seized the camels. They killed the servants, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And then the fourth messenger came. Your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in their oldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came across the desert. It struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead. And I alone have escaped to tell you. Job rose. He tore his robe. He shaved his head. And he fell on the ground. And he worshipped. He said, and these words have been repeated for thousands of years by people in every kind of darkness. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. We pause here because this matters. Not because Job felt nothing. He clearly felt everything. He tore his robe. He shaved his head. These were not calm gestures. They were the ancient acts of grief. He was devastated. But in the devastation, something else was present too. An orientation, a turning, even now, even here, toward the source of all he had been given. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Not, I understand. Not, this is right. Simply, even now, I turn toward you. That is one of the most honest prayers in all of Scripture. Not a prayer that resolves everything, a prayer that holds grief and trust at the same time. Like two hands that don't let go of each other, even in the dark. Let that be with you tonight, whatever you are holding. You don't have to resolve it. You only have to breathe. Rest easy. Job is on the ground, but he is not abandoned, and neither are you. In the land of Uz, where the dust had settled over what had been a flourishing estate, where the fields lay empty and the houses were quiet, Job sat among ashes. The heavenly council gathered again, and again God pointed to Job. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to destroy him without reason. And the adversary said, Skin for skin. All that a man has, he will give for his life. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And God said, He is in your hand. Only spare his life. Job did not know this second conversation either. He only knew what happened next. Sores. Terrible, agonizing sores. From the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. He took a piece of broken pottery to scrape himself, and he sat in the ashes. His wife came to him. Her grief had turned to bitterness. Do you still hold fast your integrity? She said. Curse God and die. She had lost everything too. Her children, her home, her security. And now she was watching her husband suffer in an ash heap outside the city walls. Her words sound harsh, but underneath them is someone who has broken. Job answered her quietly. You speak as one of the foolish women would speak. Shall we receive good from God, and shall we not receive evil? And in all of this, Job did not sin with his lips. He held on, with his body covered in sores, his wife telling him to let go. He held on. Not because he understood, not because it felt right, but because something in him could not bring itself to turn away from the source of everything he had loved. That kind of holding on is not heroic. It is barely dignified. It is fingertips on a ledge. It is, I don't understand, but I am still here. 3 of Job's friends heard what had happened: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They came from a distance to mourn with him and comfort him. When they saw him from far off, they did not recognize him. His suffering had changed him that much. They wept. They tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads. And then they sat with him on the ground for 7 days and 7 nights. 7 days. No one said a word, because they saw that his suffering was very great. That is one of the most tender things in the whole story. Before they got things wrong, before they started explaining and accusing, they simply sat in the presence of grief that was too large for words. Rest gently. Job is not alone. Not yet. After 7 days, Job spoke, and what he said was not a neat, composed prayer. It was a cry that had been building through 7 days of pain and silence, through the nights when the stars that had once seemed friendly now seemed cold and far away. He cursed the day he was born. Let the day perish on which I was born. Let that day be darkness. Let God above not seek it. Let no light shine on it. He wished the night of his conception had been swallowed by darkness and never counted among the days of the year. He asked, "Why did I not die at birth? Why did the knees receive me? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept. Then I would have been at rest." This is not a polished prayer. It is a man at the end of his endurance, saying the truest thing he can, wishing he had never been born. Not because he has given up faith, but because he is in agony, and he is honest about it. The book of Job does not punish him for saying this. It preserves it. It holds it carefully. It says, "This belongs here too." The groan belongs in Scripture. The darkness of the night belongs here. You do not have to make it prettier than it is. Job asked a question that has no easy answer. Why is light given to one in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it does not come, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? He felt enclosed, like the hedge God had built around him for protection had become a wall, like the very faithfulness that had defined his life had somehow led him here, where he could not see the way forward. That is a feeling many people know. The sense that doing everything right has not protected you from everything wrong. That the life you built with such care has come undone in ways you did not choose and cannot explain. But here is what Job did not do. He did not stop speaking to God. He was furious, confused, in agony, but he kept directing his words toward heaven. He kept bringing his grief to the source. He did not walk away from the conversation, and that, in itself, is a kind of faith. Let his honesty give yours permission tonight. Whatever you have been holding quietly, whatever question you have not said out loud, it is allowed. Breathe slowly. The night is long, but morning is in it somewhere. Then Eliphaz spoke. He was the eldest of the 3 friends and the gentlest in tone. He began carefully, praising Job's past goodness, acknowledging his teaching of others. But then he said, "Think now, who that was innocent ever perished? Or where were the upright cut off? As I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same." He meant it kindly, but what he was saying underneath the gentle language was, "This must be your fault. Innocent people don't suffer like this. Therefore you must have done something. Examine yourself, confess, and God will restore you." Job's second friend, Bildad, was less gentle. Does God pervert justice? If your children have sinned against him, he has delivered them into the hand of their transgression. If you will seek God and plead with the Almighty for mercy, if you are pure and upright, surely then he will rouse himself for you. That is a colder statement. It implies Job's children died because of their own sin. It implies that Job's restoration depends entirely on his purity. It has the shape of theology, but not the warmth of wisdom. And Zophar was the most direct. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. These were not wicked men. They were not trying to wound Job. They were doing what educated, thoughtful people often do when confronted with suffering they cannot explain. They reached for a framework, a system, a way of making it make sense. Because if suffering is random, if a blameless man can lose everything through no fault of his own, then the universe is not safe. And that is a frightening thought. So they explained, they theologized, they pointed at Job and said, there must be something hidden, because the alternative was too frightening to accept. Job listened, and then Job answered, not with submission, not with confession, but with the truth as he knew it. Will you speak falsely for God? Will you show partiality toward him? Will you plead the case for God? Will it be well with you when he searches you out? He told his friends their wisdom was ash, their defenses of clay. And then he said something extraordinary. Though he slay me, I will hope in him. Even now, even in this, I will hope. Let that be enough for tonight. That kind of hope doesn't need to understand everything. It only needs to still be present. And it is. Rest quietly. We are halfway through the dark. At the city gates of ancient Uz, where the dust rose in small clouds with every gust of wind, where Job had once sat in honor among the elders, he now sat in ashes. Where men had once risen when he arrived, now he was someone others turned from in the street. Where his counsel had been sought like spring rain, now he was a byword. The grief of losing your place in the community is its own kind of pain. Job had lost his children, his health, his possessions, and now his belonging. The community that had held him had stepped back, as communities sometimes do when suffering makes people afraid. But he kept speaking. He was reasoning with God. He was filing a grievance with the court of heaven. I desire to speak to the Almighty, he said, and I desire to argue my case with God. He didn't want theories from his friends. He wanted to go directly to the source. He wanted to lay his case before the one who had allowed this. He wanted a hearing. He wanted to be truly seen. He said, "Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high. My friends scorn me. My eyes pour out tears to God, that he would argue the case of a man with God as a son of man does with his neighbor." He was asking for a mediator, someone to stand between him and the silence of heaven, not to accuse God, but to ensure that what Job was saying was truly being heard, to make the distance crossable. And then he said the words that have stopped readers cold for thousands of years. "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. I know that my Redeemer lives." Out of the ash heap, out of the pain, out of the confusion and the darkness and the unanswered questions, this certainty. Not about the why, not about the how, but about the who. Someone is there, someone sees, someone will stand. You don't have to know the why tonight. You only need to know that the one who sees you is still there. Rest now. The story is still moving. Job's friends gave their final speeches. A fourth voice appeared, a younger man named Elihu, who had been listening and growing frustrated with all of them. He spoke at length, trying new angles. He said God was greater than any human could comprehend. He said suffering was sometimes a correction, a shaping, a form of teaching the soul cannot receive any other way. He meant well, but Job had grown quiet. There comes a point in certain kinds of grief when the words of others, however well meant, simply cannot reach you. When the theologizing falls silent against the weight of lived experience. When what you need is not more explanation, but presence. Job made his final speech. He listed the things he had always tried to be. A man who had not walked in falsehood. A man who had not denied justice to his servants when they had a grievance against him. A man who had not trusted in his wealth or gloated over an enemy's trouble. A man who had not concealed his sin. "Let me be weighed in a just balance," he said, "and let God know my integrity." He did not say, "I am perfect." He said, "Weigh me. Look at me honestly. I believe I have lived with integrity, and I cannot understand why this has happened to me, and I want an answer." He signed his name to it. He waited. There is something deeply human about that moment. The demand for fairness, the insistence that the way we live should have something to do with what happens to us. Job was not wrong to want that. The desire for justice, for goodness to be rewarded, for faithfulness to mean something, is not a naive desire. It is woven into us. It is part of what it means to be made in the image of a God who is just. And yet the world sometimes does not cooperate. And when it doesn't, we sit in ashes like Job, holding our integrity and our bewilderment in the same hands, waiting for someone to answer. The book does not shame him for this. It honors it. It gives it page after page. The honest bewilderment of a good person before unjust suffering is not a failure of faith. It is one of the truest things a human being can experience. You may know something of this tonight. Some question you've been carrying. Some thing that didn't add up. Some loss that came without explanation. You don't have to resolve it. You only have to breathe and wait. The answer is coming. Not in the way Job expected, but it is coming. And then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. Out of the whirlwind. Not out of the silence. Not in a gentle dream. Not in a still, small voice. From a storm. From a great turning wind that lifted the dust and bent the trees and filled the air with sound and power and presence. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I will question you, and you make it known to me. This was not a rebuke of Job's faith. It was an invitation, a demanding one, but an invitation. God spoke directly, powerfully, personally, to this man who had been sitting in ashes, crying out, wondering if anyone heard. Someone heard. And the response came not as an explanation, but as a question. A vast, sweeping, humbling question. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. Have you entered into the springs of the sea, or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been revealed to you? Have you comprehended the expanse of the earth? Where is the way to the dwelling of light? Have you entered the storehouses of the snow? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades, or loose the belt of Orion? Can you lead forth the morning star in its season? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Question after question. Not to crush Job, not to humiliate him, but to open something, to take him from the small, airless room of his suffering and bring him, suddenly, into a space so vast that his question, which had felt all-consuming, became something he could hold differently. Not because the pain was less, but because the one speaking was so much larger than the pain. That is what can happen when we are brought face to face with something bigger than ourselves. Not that our grief disappears, but that it has more room to breathe in. That we remember we are held by a Creator who knows where the snow is stored, who calls the stars by name, who knows us. Let yourself rest in that vastness for a moment. You don't have to hold the whole sky. It is already held. Breathe slowly. The whirlwind is speaking, and Job is listening. In the wide open land of ancient Uz, where the sky stretched from horizon to horizon, and where the whirlwind had finally stilled, Job sat in the clearing quiet. The voice from the storm had continued. It had asked him about the rain and the lightning, about the lion's hunt and the raven's hunger, about the mountain goat giving birth in the high rocky places, about the wild ox and the ostrich and the horse that charges into battle without fear, about the hawk and the eagle and the whole vast, intricate, attended-to world that moves and breathes and feeds and sleeps and rises again. All of this complexity and wildness and care, all of it held and ordered and attended to. And Job, who had been at the center of his own suffering for so long, was briefly given a view from outside, not above his pain, but beside it, in context, inside something so much larger. And Job answered, "I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know." He was not confessing that he had done something wrong. He was confessing that he had been thinking too small, that the framework he had brought to his suffering was not large enough for the God he was actually dealing with. "I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear," he said, "but now my eye sees you." Before, Job had knowledge of God. He had belief. He had practice, the morning prayers, the faithful turning of the face toward the holy. But this was something different. This was encounter. This was seeing, not just hearing. The difference between knowing about an ocean and standing at its edge with the water around your feet. He did not receive the answer he had asked for. He did not get the explanation of why. What he received instead was presence, overwhelming, vastly larger than expected. The presence of something so real and so immense that his questions, which had felt like the whole horizon, became smaller in the best possible way, held inside something larger. Sometimes that is the answer. Not the explanation, but the presence. Not the why, but the who. Rest in that for a moment. You don't have to understand everything. You only have to be here. And you are not alone in being here. Then God said something unexpected. He turned to Eliphaz and said, "My anger burns against you and against your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." The friends, the ones who had come to comfort, the ones who had sat in the ashes for 7 days, the ones who had tried so carefully to explain. God was not pleased with their explanations. But Job, who had cursed the day of his birth, Job, who had demanded an audience with heaven, Job, who had called their theology ash, Job had spoken what was right. This is one of the most surprising turns in the whole book. The man who had cried out, who had refused easy comfort, who had pushed against the comfortable theology of his friends. That man had spoken truth. And the friends who had defended God's justice by accusing Job, they had not, because they had made God too small, too transactional, too predictable, too much like a system, and not enough like a person. And Job, confused, grief-stricken, honest, reaching, had insisted on the complexity of it, had refused to pretend it made sense when it didn't. Now therefore take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and offer up a burnt offering for yourselves. And my servant Job shall pray for you, for I will accept his prayer. So the friends went, and Job prayed for them. Job, sitting in ashes, his body still covered in sores, prayed for the people who had accused him. He lifted up what they could not lift for themselves. He interceded for the ones who had added to his pain. That act of prayer, quiet, faithful, generous, was where something shifted. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends. The restoration did not begin with Job's understanding. It did not begin with his perfect theology or his composed acceptance. It began with his compassion, with the willingness to hold space for others, even in his own suffering, even after what they had said, even from the ash heap. That is not easy grace.
That is costly grace, and it was the door. Let that be a thought that rests beside you tonight. Not an obligation, just a possibility. That the act of holding others gently, even in our own hard seasons, can sometimes be the place where our own turning begins. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. His brothers and sisters came to him. All who had known him before came and ate with him, and showed him sympathy, and comforted him for all that had happened. Each of them gave him a piece of money and a ring of gold. The Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 donkeys. He had 7 more sons and 3 more daughters. And his daughters, the story tells us this with a particular tenderness, were the most beautiful women in all the land. And Job gave them an inheritance along with their brothers. This was not common in that world. It was the act of a man who had been changed by what he had gone through, who had come out the other side with a different understanding of what mattered, who treated his daughters as equals in the inheritance, in a world that almost never did. Job lived 140 years after all of this. He saw his children and his children's children, 4 generations. He saw the world continue, season after season, year after year. He saw the sunrise over us again and again and again. And the story says simply, he died an old man and full of days. Full of days. Not full of answers. The book does not tell us that Job finally understood why. It tells us that he lived, that he was given more days and he filled them,
that the life he thought had ended was in fact not over. And tonight, wherever you are in your own story, whatever your ash heap has looked like or looks like now, there are still days ahead of you, still mornings, still the slow accumulating grace of time given and received. You may not have your answers yet. Job waited a very long time for anything like resolution, and even then, the why was never fully spoken. But the presence was given, and the life continued, and it was, in the end, full. Let yourself be full tonight, even if just for these quiet minutes.
Full of rest, full of breath, full of the permission to stop explaining and simply be here. The stars over Uz are still turning, patient and ancient, and carrying no judgment, only light, only the quiet, faithful presence of what has always been there. Rest now. You have walked far tonight, in the wide golden fields of ancient Uz, where the sheep moved in their familiar patterns through the late afternoon light, and the hills glowed warm and amber at the horizon. An old man sat at the city gate again, not in ashes, in the place of honor he had once known. And the elders around him listened, as they always had, when he spoke. What Job must have known by then, what he could never have known in the ash heap, was the whole shape of the story. How the morning after the darkest night is still morning. How the ground that was ash can grow things again. How time, moving through and beyond suffering, does not erase it, but gathers it up into something that can eventually, slowly, become wisdom. Not all suffering leads here. Job's story is not a formula. It is not a promise that every loss will be doubled and returned, that every ash heap will bloom, that every friendship will be mended. Life does not always work that way. But what the story of Job gives us is something the world does not always offer: a long view. A view from beyond the crisis. A view that says, even when you cannot see the path, there is still a road ahead. Even when the night seems total, it is not permanent. Even when the questions seem unanswerable, the presence behind them is real. Job learned something in the whirlwind that he could not have learned any other way. He learned what it was like to hear the voice he had been praying to, not to understand it, to hear it, to feel its reality, to know that the one he had been reaching toward was not distant, was not deaf, was not merely a concept, but an actual, vast, attending presence. That knowledge changed him. You can see it in the way the story ends. The inheritance given equally to daughters and sons. The old man full of days. The life that went on and on, quietly, faithfully, after the storm. It is not a triumphant ending. It is something quieter than triumph. Something more like peace. Peace that has been walked through, not handed to. Peace that knows what it cost. Peace that has sat in ashes and still believes. That is a different kind of peace from the peace of someone who has never had their world undone. It is deeper, more resilient, more real. If you are walking through your own ash heap right now, this peace is not closed to you. It may not come tonight, but it is not beyond you. Let the evening light fall over Uz. Let the sheep move in their slow, familiar way across the slope and rest. Job's later life is told in only a few verses, but those few verses are enough. More children, the most beautiful daughters in the land, given a full inheritance. 4 generations of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. 140 years of ordinary days after the extraordinary suffering. Full of days. That phrase. It does not mean he had no more difficulty. It does not mean the losses didn't leave their marks. It means that when life was given back to him, he received it. He filled the days. He showed up for them. He did not disappear into regret or bitterness or the memory of loss. He inhabited his days. This is its own kind of courage. The courage to live again after loss. The courage to love again after grief. The courage to let the new morning be new, even when you remember the night. Job did not forget what had happened. How could he? His body remembered. His spirit remembered. 7 sons and 3 daughters, the first ones, were gone. No restoration gives back exactly what was lost. The new children were not replacements. They were new gifts, different gifts, received by a man who had been made into someone who could receive them differently, with more awareness, perhaps, of how fragile and precious the ordinary days are. There is an old saying, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away." Job said it from the ash heap in the raw shock of the first day. It was faith at its most stripped down and honest. And then he lived long enough to add, quietly, from the inside of his own experience, "And the Lord gives again." Not always in the same form, not always on our timeline, but the giving does not end. Let that rest beside you as you drift toward sleep. The giving does not end. Whatever you are waiting for, the source of all good things has not closed. The hand that made the morning has not withdrawn. You are alive. You are breathing. The night around you is held by the same vast intelligence that knows where the snow is stored and calls the stars by name. You are not forgotten. You have never been forgotten. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your thoughts slow. You don't have to hold anything tightly anymore. Job sat again at the city gates, but not as the man who had sat there before the losses. Something had been rearranged in him. You could see it in the way he listened, more carefully, with less certainty that he knew the answer before someone had finished speaking. And in the way he named his daughters, Jemima, Keziah, and Karen Hapuk, and gave them an inheritance alongside their brothers. Small acts of dignity, quietly repeated. A man who had come to see differently. 4 generations, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. Job saw them all. He told them something of what had happened, of the ash heap and the whirlwind, of the friends who had gotten it wrong and the prayers that had come anyway, of the God who had answered in a way he had not expected. Perhaps the grandchildren found it hard to imagine. Job, this familiar, gentle old man who told stories in the evening firelight, sitting in ashes, waiting for an answer from the storm.
The shape of a person's history is not always visible on the outside.
The mark that deep grief makes is internal. The change it brings is not a scar you can always see, but a quality of presence, a softness, an attentiveness, a capacity to sit with others in pain without immediately reaching for an explanation. Job had that now. He had earned it in the hardest way, and he gave it away in small daily acts for the rest of his life. He died full of days, and the fullness was real, not because nothing had been lost, but because what was given back and what grew from what remained was received with open and grateful and finally very wise hands. Let that be a kind of hope for you tonight. Whatever you are holding, whatever you have been through or are still in the middle of, the fullness is not foreclosed. The remaining days are still days. The story is still being written in ways you cannot see from where you currently stand. And the writing of it, whatever it is held inside the same vast intelligence that knows where the morning lives and what the snow is stored for, and the name of every star above the land of Uz. Rest now. You are in good hands. The sun goes down over the land of Uz. The stars appear, one by one, in the way they have always appeared. Not all at once, but gradually, as if the darkness peels back its layers and reveals what was there all along. We have sat with Job tonight through the whole ark, from the prosperous estate and the morning prayers to the first messenger, and the second, and the third, and the fourth, to the ash heap and the sores, and the bitter question, and the friends' well-meaning failures, to the long speeches, and the reaching for a mediator, and the confession of faith from the middle of despair, to the whirlwind and the vast questioning, and the encounter that rearranged something internal, to the prayer for the friends, and the turning of the fortunes, and the long, full, quiet years that followed. That is a long story to carry, and it was a long story to live. But the ending, full of days, is not incidental. It is the point. Not that suffering has no lasting mark, not that everything returns to exactly what it was, but that the life went on, that each day that came after the ash heap was a gift received by a man who knew now exactly how to receive it. The ordinary day, the day with nothing dramatic in it, the day of ordinary light and ordinary work and ordinary rest. The ordinary day is the gift. Job had 140 years of ordinary days after the extraordinary suffering, and he received them. He was present in them. He inhabited his days. This is the quiet invitation tonight, not to understand everything, not to have arrived at peace, but to inhabit this moment, this quiet, ordinary night, with its breath and its softness and its forgetting of the day's demands. To receive it as what it is, another day, held and given, not to be taken for granted. Job lay down and slept in his time, after everything. And the sleep
was not the sleep of someone who had resolved every question, but the sleep of someone who was held.
You are held tonight, too. The night is quiet over us. The old man is at rest. The grandchildren are sleeping. And we can rest too now, quietly, without needing to know everything. The book of Job never fully explains why it happened. That is deliberate. The author was not careless. The ending does not circle back and give us the answer. It says, Job lived. Job prayed for his friends. Job received his life back. Job was full of days. The why stays open. And in that openness, there is a kind of mercy. Because if suffering were always explained, always tied to a specific lesson or purpose, then we would be in a smaller world, a world where everything could be managed, understood, controlled, where the universe was a system we could navigate correctly if only we knew the right rules. But Job's universe is not that world, and neither is ours. The whirlwind asked, "Where were you when I laid the foundations?" And the answer is, we were not there, and we are not there for most of what holds the universe together. And somehow, that is not a defeat. It is an invitation into humility, into the posture of a creature before a creator, not crushed, not shamed, but oriented. Given our proper size, given the gift of not having to understand everything in order to live. Job was made smaller by the whirlwind, and it was not a diminishment. It was a kind of freedom to say, I don't have to know all of this. I don't have to carry the weight of explanation. I don't have to make it make sense tonight. You don't have to make it make sense tonight either. Whatever is unresolved in you, whatever question is still open, whatever wound is still tender, whatever ash still remains, you do not have to resolve it in order to sleep. You do not have to have the answer in order to breathe. You do not have to understand the whirlwind in order to rest beneath the stars that its winds have never scattered. They are still there, the same stars Job looked at from the ash heap, the same stars that watched him live his long, full life, the same stars that are out tonight above wherever you are in the world, patient, ancient, quietly attending. You are a small, beloved, held creature in a vast and carefully ordered world. You do not need to carry it. It is already carried. Let yourself be small tonight in the very best way. Set down the explaining. Set down the managing. Set down whatever has made today heavy. The stars have this. You can rest now. Tonight, the story of Job folds itself gently around you like a worn and faithful robe. You have walked with him through it all. You have heard the four messengers. You have sat in the ash heap. You have listened to the friends who meant well and got it wrong. You have heard the confession of faith from the middle of despair. I know that my Redeemer lives, and felt what it cost to say that, and what it was worth. You have heard the voice in the whirlwind ask its vast and humbling questions, and you have watched a man answer not with full understanding, but with presence.
I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. That is the turn. That is everything. Not the restoration of the flocks, though that came. Not the vindication before the friends, though that came too. But the seeing, the encounter, the direct, overwhelming, rearranging presence of the one Job had been reaching toward in the dark. That encounter changed the rest of his life.
Not by making it perfect, by making it full. Whatever it is you have been reaching toward, whatever you have been crying out for in your own ash heaps, however they look, I believe the reaching matters. I believe the honest grief matters. I believe the refusal to pretend, the insistence on truth, even in prayer, is not a failure of faith, but a deepening of it. Job did not become someone else after the whirlwind. He became more fully himself, a self that had been through the fire and come out knowing something that cannot be known any other way. The oil lamp in the window of a house in Uz burns low now. The wick floats in the last of the oil, casting a warm and diminishing light on the clay wall beside it. Soon it will go out, but while it burns, it is enough. You are that kind of light tonight, warm and real and present. Whatever fuel you have left, it is enough for this night. You do not have to burn bright. You only have to be here. Let your eyelids grow heavy. Let the thoughts that have been circling all day settle like birds coming home to a branch. Let your breathing slow. Let the night hold you in the way that nights have always held people. Quietly, without judgment, without demanding anything in return. You have walked with a man through his darkest season and watched him come through. You have heard the voice that spoke to him in the storm. That voice is not far from you either. Sleep well. You are not walking alone. Good night from Calm Night.